Welcome back. Welcome back to Living in Mexico. I'm Ana Maria Salazar. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. We've been doing this show for, gosh, this weekend show, Living in Mexico. We've been doing it for more than, I guess, 20 years now. We've been broadcasting Living in Mexico since 2004, every weekend. Well, almost every weekend. Maybe some Christmases we haven't broadcasted it, but it's always a pleasure and honor to join you. And of course, this particular weekend is extremely interesting if you are following the elections in the United States. Now, we normally talk about U.S. elections on this show. We talk about Mexican elections, but we also talk about U.S. elections because it does affect us, who becomes the next president of the United States, regardless if you're a Mexican citizen or a U.S. citizen. And of course, with the way this electoral process has been taking place in the United States, there is a big question mark as to who's going to be the next president and what does the United States democracy looks like for the next 4 years, and what, if any, changes will take place in the bilateral relationship between both nations. Anyway, I always appreciate our following guest, Raether. He was part of he participated with the Democrats here in Mexico City, and he's a really very sharp analyst regarding not only U.S. elections, but the impact on the bilateral relationship. And so, it's always great to have you on the show. So how nervous are we?
Hey, Ana Maria. It's a pleasure being here with you again. Very nervous. I was kind of excited at first when Harris kind of jumped on the campaign and became the candidate after Biden stepped down, and she got the huge bump in percentage of popular vote preferences, sometimes even 6-7% above Trump. And we're all kind of riding on that wave. And the last couple of weeks, it's kind of died down. They're now kind of tied in all the important states. And honestly, I'm very nervous. I'm worried.
Yeah, it's been interesting to follow the campaign regarding the Latino vote or the Hispanic vote, whatever you want to call it. It was fascinating to watch the rally that took place. I believe it was in New Mexico, where President Trump basically asked, "How do you want to? What do we call you? Latinos, Hispanics?" And of course, there was a huge applause when he said Hispanic. I mean, even in terms of trying to understand the Hispanic Latino vote, it's hard to figure out where the sway is. All polls seem to indicate that more Latinos, more Hispanics will be voting for Donald Trump, including Mexican Americans, which I always think is very interesting, considering how hard he went and attacked Mexican migration, at least during the 2016 campaign, and now in this process, or at least this time around, he's been much more critical. He's been horrible regarding Haitian migrants and Venezuelan migrants, maybe less so with Mexican migrants. But I know, did you have a sense what's happening? I mean, what is your take on what's happening with the Latino vote regarding this increased support for Donald Trump?
Right, absolutely. And the thing is, there's a lot of nuance to the Hispanic
Right.
quote unquote vote. They're always trying to kind of shoebox us all into the same monolithic
Right.
electorate, and we are not. And forget about nationalities, okay? The Cubans in Florida are one thing, the Venezuelans, the Colombians, but let's talk about the most important a foreign national bloc of voters, and that is without a doubt the Mexican group in the U.S. Now, of those, certainly the first generation, the recent arrivals, those who were born in Mexico and moved to the U.S., they still have very close ties to their Mexican culture. We're talking about 50 million people, both either Mexican or Mexican descendants, who vote in the U.S. And they still have very close ties and roots, and still feel kind of miss Mexico. And if they could, they wish they could go back. And then there's the ones that are born in the US. And what we've seen is that the voting preference for Democrats, which for Hispanics used to be at 75%, right, has now dropped to below 50%. We're at 49% of preference vote from Hispanics for Democrats. And that is a huge shift that we're seeing all across the border states, many of them, but also those throughout California and even in the northern states in the US. And the reason is because these new generations, and 20% of all the new voters every year come from the Hispanic population and the Hispanic group. And what
Mhm.
happens is these folks that are born in the US, they no longer feel like they're Mexican. They no longer feel Colombian. Those roots are kind of disappearing, and they identify more with their American born persona than they do with the roots of their parents. And I think that's why we're seeing the shift in the Republican direction, because now they want to protect their future, their economy, and their interests more so than the interests of those wanting to come into the US.
Well, but still, I still think it's fascinating because I think there has been a mistake in terms of thinking that the Hispanic vote kind of revolves around the migration issue and the migration crisis. But, Donald Trump has been also horrible to, and the way he talks about Latinos and the way he talks about women, but the way he talks about Latinos, especially, recently with, the comments they made about the Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage, and then some really rude. This was a comedian at one of Donald Trump's rallies at Madison Square Garden, and this very rude joke about Hispanics and the way they reproduce themselves. I mean, but even then, I was speaking to a colleague who is represents or follows very closely the Puerto Rican vote. You would think that after that comment, there would be just kind of a humongous backlash, especially with, Bad Bunny now publicly supporting Kamala Harris. And there, I mean, it, according to him, there hasn't been that such huge quantitative change in terms of perception. Those who have decided to vote for Donald Trump apparently are still going to vote for Donald Trump, which is very surprising. The same thing with Mexican Americans. I mean, you know, he's pretty nasty to that community, but they're still going to vote for him.
Yep. And again, he's Teflon. There's those who will vote for Trump will not change their minds no matter what comes up,
Mhm.
what he is found guilty of, or what he's done in the past. He's said it last election cycle. He said, I could go walk up on New York Times Square, shoot somebody in the face, and people would
Right.
still vote for me. There's nothing the man can do to lose support. Unless, of course, he spoke against the interest of the conservatives, the evangelical conservatives. Now, other than that, there's really nothing else he can do. And so certainly a lot of these groups, including Puerto Ricans, who've, along with Mexicans, been called shithole countries, right? And the insult and he did this last time around, and he
Right.
remember when he was throwing the toilet paper at people after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and he's always been very
Nasty. Yeah,
derogatory,
very
yeah, nasty
derogatory. Yeah.
to all of Latin America. And the reality is that, again, and I go back to this point of identification. A lot of the people who live in the U.S., whether they were recent arrivals, but they're happy there, or they're new generations that were born there, they no longer identify with being Puerto Rican or being Mexican. They're like, yeah, my parents are, but I'm American. And they don't feel offended or insulted by these words. And
Mhm.
I think that's a big part of why it's not having an impact on the electoral preference.
I had I don't know if you read the article by Mary Beth Sheridan on Eduardo Verástegui, who is kind of the MAGA man in Mexico. But MAGA never really kind of was never really no tiene pies. I mean, it never really
Took
had an impact, right?
no traction.
Uh,
Yep.
no traction. But he is a spokesperson for at least the Latino community, or he claims to be, and has supported Donald Trump
Mm.
since even the last campaign. I interviewed him 4 years ago about his support for Donald Trump, despite the fact that, he's a very well-known, he does prayers every day on X, the rosary, and he is Catholic, and he's very vocal about it. And I asked him, you are campaigning against the second Catholic president of the United States, and he's like, it doesn't matter, because in our eyes he's not Catholic because of the abortion issue, which kind of brings me, I guess that is one of the big issues that people are making decisions around.
Yeah. Remember, the U.S. doesn't really vote on the economy as much perhaps as you would in people in Mexico. They're usually one issue voters, and they're usually social issues. It's the LGBT community, it's the right of females, it's what they call fundamental freedoms, meaning that they want to insert their faith and religion everywhere. So it's these items that ultimately decide who they vote for. And abortion is certainly one of the big ones, and they don't care if somebody's a Catholic or not. All they care about, and they call themselves pro-life, but really what they are is pro-birth, because once the kids are born, they don't care what happens to them. But again, Verástegui certainly has had a lot of traction with white Anglo-Saxon Protestant evangelicals and so on, the conservative base. But if you talk to Latinos and Hispanics and Mexicans in the U.S. and even in Mexico, and you tell them about Verástegui, they have no idea who he is. There's no traction, there's no following, he has no visibility. That's why his campaign here went nowhere. And he doesn't understand that, at least amongst Mexicans, whether we are here or in the US, the social issues are not as important as the economic issues. And this is why the conservative movement has no traction in Mexico, because we have bigger problems to worry about than whether somebody can abort.
One of the conclusions you get, it's a really good article. If you have the chance to read it, Mary Beth Sheridan, the MAGA man, and I guess the title is MAGA man in Mexico. Eduardo Verástegui behaved as if the MAGA issues would move conservatives in Mexico. And the reality is there is no party up until now that really encompasses Catholics, which would, if it did, it would be a very powerful party. In Mexico, it just doesn't. So that I thought is interesting. So, and the other aspect of this campaign, and I think the Democrats are going to really have to sit down and analyze this. There is no real, very public leadership, Mexican American leadership, political leadership in the United States.
Absolutely. Right. And you see it because, and I always make this point, right? There are 3 million Cubans in Florida. They have 2 senators, Marco Rubio and Cruz, right? They have 2 senators. There are over 50 million people who somehow connect, descend from, or identify as Mexicans. And we don't have a single senator. And this is why I think the U.S. Congress rather looks into Europe or Central America or South America or Cuba or any other place than really worrying about the relationship with Mexico from a legislative point of view. And I think that's essentially why. So yeah, it's very strange, very concerning, but it also reflects the large apathy that Mexicans typically have historically when it comes to politics. We are apathetic towards politics in Mexico. When they go to the U.S., they continue to be apathetic there, and that's why we just don't have the representation that such a large group as Mexicans in the U.S. should definitely have.
Do you have any sense, and let's talk about something else. Do you have any sense as to how many Americans will be voting from Mexico? Because traditionally, at least the years that I've been following Democrats abroad, at least from here in Mexico, it's just the numbers have not been, they've not been extraordinary. And I don't know if it's because there's no incentives to vote, or it's just too hard to vote. I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to get my vote. I may have to travel to the U.S. basically so I can be able to vote on Tuesday. It is what is the issue? Do we have any sense that there's more Americans voting abroad?
No, I would say the opposite. I would say that the most successful number of Americans voting from Mexico was probably last election cycle. This time around, we haven't seen as much movement, and the problem is it's an archaic system. Every electoral district in the U.S. has its own rules on what you can do. Some even allow sending your vote by fax. Most of them require you to send it in physically, drop it off at the U.S. Embassy. It has to be physical. You have to download a PDF. You have to provide all these numbers, ID, social security number, every single proof that you're actually an entitled or somebody who can vote. And then you have to put it in a security envelope. You have to cut paper, paste it on the front and the back of the envelope, sign it in a specific way. There are 3 U.S. voters in this household, and we got a response back from our office saying that one of those votes was not allowed because a number didn't match based on what they had in their database. God knows what they have in their database. So it's really hard to register. It's really hard to make sure they approve you. It's hard to print out the thing and cut it properly, and it's hard for them to get it. So if you understand that the majority of Americans living in Mexico are older folks above, probably in retirement age, in Ajijic and San Miguel de Allende and so on, And you make them go through this. Like the damn printer doesn't work, they can't vote.
Right,
Get it
right.
to the embassy, get it to FedEx so it gets to the US. It's such a pain in the butt that I think that's basically disincentivizing people from voting. And I think you see it there and you'll see it this time around.
Before you go away, do you want to make any bets, any pronosticos? Do you?
Okay, so if
Well,
the election
so
was today, and I
yeah,
follow all these betting websites on the internet,
right,
right? And
right now.
and everybody, it's like 3, 4 times more people are betting on Trump than they are on Harris. And
Right.
I think I would probably go along with that. If the vote was today, I'm convinced that Trump would probably win.
Yeah. So we'll have to see what happens on Tuesday. Maybe you can come back next weekend and we can. I'm
Always.
not too sure we may even know next weekend,
You know what?
unless
I think what's going to happen is, those states where if it's below a certain percentage point, the difference, it's an
there's
automatic recount.
weekends.
And I
Yeah.
think they're going to go into at least those 2 or 3 of those states are going to go into an automatic recount. That means it's going to take days to do it because they're going to have to do it manually, which in
Yeah.
my mind, we won't know for at least 4 or 5 days who's going to win the election.
Maybe if we're lucky till next weekend, maybe. And of course, us lawyers, I'm sure everybody's preparing, preparing, to
Yeah.
go to trial.
Actually, they were saying that Harris has a large entourage of
Bat-
lawyers ready to go on the day of
A
the election.
battalion of lawyers.
Battalion. There you go.
It's a battalion of lawyers.
Exactly.
Anyway, Grisha, right there, no sabes. I really enjoyed talking to you. And
Likewise.
let's try to talk next weekend to see what happened. Uh,
Absolutely. I look forward to
let's
that.
cross our fingers.
Yes, ma'am.
We're gonna go to commercial break. I'm Ana Maria Salazar, and you're listening and watching Living in Mexico. Please don't go away. I'll be right back.